Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the complex, high-stakes legal battle to hold multinational corporations accountable for human rights abuses across the globe. Look, we live in a hyper-globalized world. Companies cross borders effortlessly, right? But justice, well, justice has a really hard time keeping up. We're going to dive into the critical gaps in international law today and look at the ambitious efforts underway to actually close them. Here's our roadmap for This Explainer. We'll start with the accountability void. Compare soft law versus hard law, look at the domestic law patchwork, examine the gaps in global justice, and finally, wrap up with the push for a binding global treaty. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the accountability void. What happens when business crosses borders, but justice doesn't? So here's a critical question to anchor our whole discussion today. Who actually polices a multinational corporation when it's literally more powerful than a country? Historically, international law was built for states, not companies. It's kind of like trying to apply the rules of chess to a game of poker. This has left a massive void in overseeing corporate activity, especially when a parent company sits safely in a nation with super robust laws, but its subsidiaries operate in places with, let's say, much weaker governance. Okay, to make sense of this void, we really need to draw a hard line between corporate social responsibility, CSR, and actual legally enforceable duties. For decades, CSR was the big buzzword. You know, companies voluntarily highlighting their ethical practices or community programs. But CSR is not a legal duty. In 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights stepped in with a protect, respect, and remedy framework. It basically said states must protect and businesses must respect human rights. But as you'll see, clarity on paper doesn't automatically mean enforceability in the real world. If we look at the source material, severe abuses take many forms. We're talking direct actions like forced labor, indirect complicity like selling surveillance tech to oppressive regimes, or abuses buried deep down in supply chain relationships. And these aren't just random occurrences. They are highly concentrated in massive, high-risk industries. Think extractive sectors like the cobalt mining for the smartphones in our pockets, agriculture, fast fashion, and big tech. The sheer complexity of these modern supply chains makes it incredibly easy for a parent company to basically wash its hands of any liability. Moving on to Section 2, soft law versus hard law, and the chronological evolution of all this. Tracking this timeline, we actually have to go way back to the 1940s to the Nuremberg trials. This was a huge precedent where corporate executives were held accountable for war crimes. Fast forward a few decades, and we get the 2011 UN Guiding Principles, setting the modern baseline. But notice the shift recently. We're finally seeing the emergence of domestic hard law. For example, France passed its pioneering duty of vigilance law in 2017, followed by Germany's Supply Chain Due Diligence Act rolling out in 2023. And this brilliantly highlights the sharp contrast between soft law and hard law. Soft law, like the UN Global Compact or those UN Guiding Principles, is voluntary, flexible, and non-binding. It's great for raising awareness and setting norms, but honestly, it lacks teeth. Hard law, on the other hand, brings binding commitments to the table. We're talking enforceable penalties and actual civil or criminal liability. So what's the danger of relying just on soft laws? Well, it enables what the research calls human rights washing, or blue washing in the context of the UN. This loophole allows corporations to project a highly responsible, ethical image to you, me, and their investors without actually making substantive changes to how they operate. It's essentially a PR shield, just slapping an ethical sticker over a deeply flawed supply chain. All right, Section 3, the domestic law patchwork, fragmentation and regulatory arbitrage. Now, when we map out these emerging domestic laws, the inconsistencies across borders are pretty glaring. It's a real patchwork. Look at France. They have judicial enforceability, sure, but the threshold is super high. It only applies to massive companies with over 5,000 employees. Germany demands due diligence, but it mostly stops at first-tier suppliers, and crucially, offers no civil remedy for victims. In the UK, the Modern Slavery Act is reporting only. There's no actual enforcement requirement if a company treats it as a mere box-ticking exercise. And India has a unique law mandating a 2% profit spend on CSR, but it doesn't create any direct liability for human rights abuses. Because of this patchy system, we end up with something called regulatory arbitrage. This is a massive loophole. It basically means multinational corporations can just pack up and relocate their high-risk operations to countries with weaker legal protections and virtually zero enforcement. The fragmented legal landscape we have right now essentially rewards companies for finding the path of least legal resistance.
Which brings us to Section 4, gaps in global justice and exactly how companies evade accountability.
When abuses do happen, victims face absolutely massive jurisdictional barriers to get their day in court. The most famous one is the corporate veil. It's this deeply entrenched legal doctrine that safely insulates a parent company in its home country from whatever its subsidiary is doing thousands of miles away. Then you've got legal obstacles like the forum nonconvenience doctrine. Basically, parent companies use this to argue that a case should be heard in the country where the abuse occurred, even if that country's judicial system is broken or completely inaccessible to the victims. Combine those procedural shields with the astronomical cost of transnational litigation. For most victims, justice is literally out of reach. And compounding all these legal shields is a stark reality: massive power asymmetry. We really have to recognize that today's transnational corporations are often vastly wealthier and exert way more political influence than the developing host states in the global south where they operate. As detailed in the source material here, this power imbalance actually erodes the sovereignty of host states. Think about it. Governments in developing nations might be incredibly hesitant to enforce human rights standards against a massive corporation. Why? Because they're terrified of losing critical foreign capital, jobs, or trade benefits. On top of that, corporate lobbying and investor-state dispute settlements can effectively handcuff a host state's ability to protect its own citizens. Let's move to Section 5, a binding global treaty. The ultimate fix?
So what's the solution?
Well, currently on the table is the UN treaty process. Mandated back in 2014, there's an open-ended intergovernmental working group trying to formulate a legally binding multilateral instrument. The whole goal of this effort is to move past those voluntary guidelines we talked about and create a universal standard that actually applies across borders. This draft treaty is heavily engineered to close the exact loopholes we've been discussing, and it packs a serious punch. First, it introduces compulsory human rights due diligence across the entire supply chain, so no more box ticking. Second, it establishes clear juridical liability, both civil and criminal. Third, it guarantees victim-oriented access to justice. And finally, its most powerful tool, extraterritorial jurisdiction. This would explicitly give courts the power to pierce that corporate veil and stop parent companies from hiding behind their subsidiaries. But, and this is a big but, the researchers impartially note that this treaty is facing severe political and economic roadblocks. There is a deep ideological deadlock right now. Many global South nations are strongly pushing for the treaty, while several developed nations in the global North, which happen to be home to these massive corporations, much prefer voluntary measures. Plus, there is fierce corporate lobbying against it, driven by fears of heavy regulatory burdens and the prospect of a massive explosion in cross-border litigation. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to take away from this explainer. As corporations continue to grow in unprecedented wealth and influence, can international law truly adapt to police corporate power in the 21st century? Or will a fragmented patchwork system continue to leave victims without justice? Understanding these mechanisms is the very first step to answering that. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around us.